Okay, I've been advised that I've got to start promptly to squeeze everything I've got to say into the next 20, 25 minutes. The last conference I did online, I had 99 allotted time. So somehow I got to stretch out a bit into all this time. So I hope there'll be loads of time for questions. And you can even feel free to sort of chime in as I'm talking if you wish. Now, I feel this is a bit of a, I'm the ranty guy at the end of the agenda. So it's quite an aggressive title. And I suppose it's about advice in general. I'm sort of going to talk about how people give lots of advice for technical companies in particular, product companies and scaling companies, and how most of it is a complete waste of time. I do have a beautifully crafted deck, which I'm going to sort of go through. But maybe first I'll tell you the price of entry. The price of entry is kind of listening to me about who I am and the company and things like that. So I'm the CEO of a company called Relative Insight. We're an advanced language analytics company. So we're a technology software as a service platform. We are used mainly to drive value out of text and companies has, and that's normally applied in consumer insights and it's applied in customer experience realms. We get used by both brands directly and agencies. So we have brands like Sky and Amazon and GlaxoSmithKline and John Lewis and all kinds of really great companies use us on the brand side. And then on the agency side, we've got people like Weber Shandwick and RGA and Hall & Partners and McCann and people like that. Scale, we're like 40, 45 people. We have 3 completely empty offices at the moment. We have one in Lancaster, one in London, and one in New York. So that's kind of the story. So with that, that's my background. It's the 3rd company I've been CEO of, though. All the companies I've run have been venture capital backed at one point or another. They've all been VC backed. I've exited them as well. So we've done quite a bit. I've also got, because you get lucky once and exit a company, people think you get lucky all the time. So I get asked back to run companies. And I also get asked to mentor on accelerators and things like that. And I was also for a time on the board of a co-working company. So I've had a lot of exposure to the startup world and how things go. So I'm also fully aware that I'm about to give a lot of advice about advice. I do recognize the irony in that. Don't worry. Now, most advice is well-intentioned, but we're in an era, particularly in technology companies and startups, where the industry of helping startups is almost as big as the industry of startups itself. And that means there's a load of advice flying around. And people like to give advice. And it can be valuable and it's always required. But with so much of it flying around, you really need to be circumspect, both with the advice you give, if you're in a position of being asked for your advice. And you also need to think hard about who you're asking for advice when you need it. And because if you don't think it through, it can be a colossal waste of time. So if you're just in this and you're just sort of passing time to the end of the day for the closing remarks from Katie, and you want to get back to your email, then you can just sort of read this quote, which basically sums up my view of advice. I'd highly recommend just Googling "Wear Sunscreen," Mary Schmidt. It's a fantastic speech that was a commencement speech that was given, and this is an extract from it. And it kind of illustrates why advice can be a tricky thing. There are, in my view, in the startup world, about 4 reasons advice tends to fail. And they are, the first is not understanding the advice equation. The second is not recognizing the existence of bullshit mountain. The third is an abundance of what advice, but not how advice. And the fourth is missing the right advice because you're mistaking the importance of depth with breadth of experience. Okay, so with that in mind, let's get on to number one, the advice equation. And it's this. So what I find is that people love to be asked to give advice, and particularly people like me. So I'm 47, and so kind of been there, getting on a bit. And when someone asks you for advice, it's you get this nostalgic chance to get this kind of opportunity of confirmation of all your experience, that actually you were right and you were wise and all this type of stuff. But the problem is you tend to look back on what you've done and think about your particular situation or your experience, your particular field. And of course, all of your viewpoint is dictated by what you've done. And you sort of fool yourself into thinking you were probably a bit more successful or a bit cleverer rather than lucky. And then a lot of this stuff tends to be looking back in time. And just naturally what happens is nostalgia sort of rears its head. And so things sound better and you think it was smarter than it was, and so on and so on. If I was going to be really cynical, I might add another multiplication in here, which is hidden agenda. I think particularly in the industry of helping startups, if you don't know why someone's in the business of helping a startup, you really should. So sometimes there's an agenda here as well, but I won't be so cynical today. So let me give you a really good example of why this kind of went awry for me personally. So Relative Insight is a SaaS business. My experience before I ran companies, I was an enterprise software sales guy. And I did that in the States and in Asia for a while. And almost all of those kind of deals I was doing were pretty big ticket. So 7-figure, $1 million deals. They were all sort of long sales cycle. They were all what I would call sort of big corporate Mr. Enterprise deals. Okay. And so that's my experience, and I'd done it as a career. And so when I ended up sort of running and doing the early sales at Relative Insight, what's the optimal business model for Relative Insight? Well, obviously, it's going to be big scale enterprise sales, because I was the only commercial person, and I was applying my nostalgia of my experience into Relative Insight. And it was okay, don't get me wrong. We ended up selling a lot of stuff and we had some big customers. But it wasn't actually quite the right way of doing things. And it was only when I realized I was suffering from my own nostalgia and experience and opened my mind up to perhaps another sales model. When we got our new VP of sales in, he came at the market from a completely different set of experiences. He's too young to be nostalgic. So, but he had a different set of experiences, different angle. We applied his model, and actually we got this whole new, fast-growing set of customers very, very quickly. So I'm as guilty as anyone else is following my own advice and not checking my nostalgia and experience at the door. So this is the first one. So when you're giving out advice, if you're asked for advice by anybody, really think through whether you should be giving that advice. So I frequently get, ask for advice, and 50% of the time I'll say nah, because I honestly, I really want to help, and I want to sound clever, and I want to sound helpful, but I really don't, but I'm stretching. I really don't have much experience of your field, and anything I say just would be quite dangerous. So think that through. And if you're asking for advice, think through the background of the person and whether that's really going to apply to you. Okay, number 2, bullshit mountain. So I love bullshit mountain because you can apply this to all kinds of different things. But this is the relationship between what you think you know and the time that you've been doing that thing. And this is my expertly hand-drawn curve, which represents bullshit mountain. Now, depending on the topic, the time you've been doing something to get over bullshit mountain, which is right here, it might be years or decades, or it might be days or weeks, but it almost always exists. And it's a dangerous place to get advice from. So probably the current greatest illustration of bullshit mountain right now is any bit of coronavirus advice you've ever had. So if you think about the gestation of advice on coronavirus, there was like a colossal bullshit mountain when everyone sort of read a couple of articles and it is an instant expert. And then everyone realizes actually they don't know anything. And then there's a bit of humility and, you know, things start kind of going into the plateau of wisdom, let's call it. The problem with bullshit mountain is that if you're just starting out in a topic and you're looking at advice, it's really hard to figure out the difference between someone who's on bullshit mountain and someone who's on the slope of enlightenment and wisdom at the tail end of this, because they both know more than you, or at least think they know more than you. And the other problem is that people who are on top of bullshit mountain generally are they tend to be louder and gobbier in general than people who are much further down the wisdom curve. So after you go over bullshit mountain, you tend to be maybe a bit humbler. You tend to have a bit more humility, and you tend not to shout about it as much. Whereas people in bullshit mountain like to gob off no end. So the hard bit here, when you're looking for really good advice, is figuring out how to get to the people at the end when they're actually the quietest people, and who are getting on with life and have realized that they don't really have all the answers, or at least not the answers they thought they had, and they're just getting on with it. Those are the people who normally are the best sources of advice, hands down. I don't have much advice about how to get to them, but those are the people you really want to get to. So number 3, this is really, really common, especially, I mean, this is directly applicable to scaling tech companies. The advice of what to do when the hard part is how to do it. So, for example, there are few phrases that will get me riled up as much as this. I think the other one is probably, yeah, I'm working on a startup. It's inside a big company, but it reacts just like a startup. That's the other one that really makes me boil. But this one is classic. You know, when you're doing a startup, it's crucial that you hire the best people. And it's like, really, is that the best you can offer in terms of advice? That's not hard. This isn't hard. Knowing that you have to hire good people is not hard. The hard bit is hiring a VP of sales who's good. How do you do that? Because if it's a good VP of sales, they're probably making a fantastic living selling stuff for other people in successful companies. So how are you going to persuade that person to jack it all in and come and join your fledgling enterprise? How do you do that? How do you persuade them to do that? That's the hard bit. Or how do you hire a world-class product manager when you've never had a product manager in your company and no one in the company has ever done the job. How do you even know what great looks like? So this is the hard stuff. Advice about what to do is almost completely useless. It's normally always, it's the how stuff is the hard stuff. I'll give you a couple more examples. This one I love. And this goes for almost any advice about investors I've ever heard. Get really great alignment is one good one. Well, this just assumes that you've got optionality in your investor choices, and it assumes that, well, if you don't think you're getting alignment with investor A, you can easily just go off and talk to investor B and get alignment with them. And if you don't like them, you can talk to C, and so on and so on and so on. But really, that's not how life works. In my experience, you don't have a sort of a laundry list of investors who really want to get in with you. You've got to manage this. And if we really want to take this advice to the nth degree, if you don't get alignment, how do you walk away? Do you walk away? How are you in the position to walk away? Stuff like that. This is the key stuff. So this one I love as well. Then this strategy comes up a lot when you're in scale up, because especially when you're hiring people, because a lot of people see that you're starting to scale up and they really want to be involved in strategy because it's sexy. But I like to say that most strategy I've ever heard is post-rationalized. It's always the strategy is given by the person who probably did exactly the same things as everyone else, but got lucky once or twice on the way and ended up talking on stage about their genius strategy, when really all they were doing is connecting the dots backwards. Strategy is important, don't get me wrong, but it's nowhere near as important as having cash in the bank and having tactics. Strategy is easy when you've got cash in the bank. I promise you that. So getting tactics right, the steps on the way to executing, again, that's the hard bit. This is another one, so I am on a total rant now, so I'm filling the time. I'll try and draw to a close. Great culture. This is another one, which we sort of been around the houses on. So that's an easy thing to say. That's what to do. How do you do it? That's the hard bit. How do you assess what it is? And so on and so on. I mean, it's a whole nother presentation. For what it's worth, your culture is what you do, not what you say you are. It's what you do day to day. So that's the sort of the how stuff the how advice is way more valuable than the what advice. Okay. Fourth one, breadth versus depth. This is a bit of a defense of venture capitalists. So sometimes you'll hear it said that, well, what do they know? They don't actually run a business, or they've never done it. And so sometimes you'll see advice discounted because it's from a generalist. So the key thing here is to understand what advice is applicable and what data point knowledge is needed. So what I mean by that is VCs, for example, in general, have done loads of deals. They have done way more deals than you ever will. Okay, they maybe do 20 deals a year, maybe more. So they know how deal flow, deal structure works. They might be generic VCs in that they're not specifically technology orientated, but they do know how to put deals together. Then you might get, say, software as a service specialist VCs, and they've got more depth, but they do fewer deals because they're specialists in SaaS. And then we've got you, and only you know your business to the depth you know it. And you're the only person who ever will know your business to that depth. But don't let that mean that you discount advice from generalists. So common things here. Founder share structure is a classic. Well, you're special and your friends are special, and we're going to put a share structure together which reflects us because we're special. Always results in carnage. And if you take that to a VC earlier on, they'll almost always shake their head at your share structure, and they'll always advise a certain share structure. And they're normally right because they've seen it fail loads of times. Lawyers don't know your business inside and out, but you would happily take legal advice from a lawyer. Cash flow, VCs are exceptionally good at sort of giving advice on cash flow because they've seen companies having to manage that over and over and over again. So, will they know how to really sell to key customers in your market? Probably not. But will they know how to do these critical operational mundane things? Yeah, they'll know a lot more about it than you. So balance up your breadth and your depth. So those are the four: the advice equation, bullshit mountain, what, not, how, breadth versus depth. If you're going to remember two, I would say probably bullshit mountain and what, not, how. And with that, I will finish, I think, with 10 minutes to go, with one more quote from Oscar Wilde of Naturally. So I now need to navigate around and stop sharing.